Linda and I have had an interesting time over the last year or two. We've joined forces with Trees for Bees and GNS Science. And before you start asking, GNS Science, gosh, aren't they the earthquake, tsunami, volcano people? Yes, we are. But we also have a facility in Wellington called the National Isotope Centre. And as part of that, we're New Zealand's leading isotope organisation, and we do specialised work on isotopes, and these can be applied to geology through to food, of course. And I've been involved in this test, as Barry was saying, about sugars. Anyway, to cut a long story short, the instruments that I use require very small amounts of material to analyse. And when Linda was faced with her needing to know protein contents of her various pollens, she was like, oh my goodness, how am I going to collect, a gram of pollen from each plant because I need to do this dark age method to get the nitrogen. I was like, no, we need a few grains and that's all it is to it. We'll analyse it. So we are actually supporting Linda with her nitrogen and protein measurements on pollen. We've also managed to offer her some co-funding, and I hope that's also hoping to build up the nitrogen information. We also have New Zealand specialists on pollen identification because, of course, while pollen's well known overseas, New Zealand pollen is very unique. We hardly know a very small corner of what our pollen looks like under a microscope. So one of the things Linda is helping us to do in return is to build a pollen atlas to make an identification guide for New Zealanders and overseas people to understand pollen. And also part of the spin-offs from Trees to Bees has been understanding how New Zealand plants work in general. We don't actually know how they photosynthesize all these plants. We don't know if they're photosynthesizing with a C4 action or a C3 action or crossing over, and how they're nitrogen fixing or what sort of nitrogen nutrients these plants need. So all of this is actually falling out as an aside, and Linda and I are working very hard together, not only to meet her requirements for Trees for Bees, but she's also helping me and being wonderfully generous with her time and information about how these things are going to expand our knowledge around trees, bees, and eventually honey. So my perspective is coming from a honey quality, and I'm coming from a more top-down approach rather than the bottom-up approach. And my aim is to have good quality honey to be able to sell so that the overseas importers aren't rejecting our product and we're not getting a terrible name. But the things we need to consider are at the grassroots, because what you're going to put into the bees and essentially transmits to your honey. So what do bees need to survive? Well, first off, as we said, they have to have fresh water. They need a carbohydrate source, and that's usually nectar or the beekeeper feeding sugars. They need a protein source, and there's a couple of other things that we find in proteins that are absolutely critical, and those are the fats, the vitamins, the minerals, and essential amino acids. Like people, we all need a good varied diet. I put a provider down the bottom because I think the art of beekeeping has changed from what it used to be. Beekeeping is, to me, a very technical subject, and people are trying to make it easy by just slapping out a whole lot of sugar and a whole lot of protein, and that's the food for the bees, and they'll go and get the nectar and make honey, and that's great. But I still strongly believe that there is an art to beekeeping, and that art is predicting the nutritional requirements of your colony before decline occurs. Those bees are animals. A lot of people are treating them overseas as disposable insects. For me, they're as important as cows, sheep, goats, and all the other animals in the fields that we see. They need treatment the same way, and you need to be understanding what's happening in those bees. So let's take a look at what we're going to give those bees to help them through the entire year. Well, ideally, as I said, they need water, they need carbohydrates, which is nectar. Now, what is nectar? Well, it's out there, it's found in flowers, obviously. This is pretty basic stuff. It's a reward to the pollinator. That's keeping the bees coming to them. And the nectars, they're containing all the sugars that we want. And these are the mono, di, and trisaccharides. Now, what is the main components? The fructose, glucose, and sucrose. So what I've got there is a nice looking sucrose molecule, and actually sucrose is a disaccharide. That means two rings, and basically fructose is one of them and glucose is the other. The bees take in sucrose, and they need to expend a bit of energy to chop it in half, cleave it where that oxygen bond in the middle is, and they bring it into fructose and sucrose. So actually in most honeys you shouldn't find sucrose because the bees are doing their job properly. They're converting the sucrose into the monomers. But some plants while they produce sucrose, other plants don't produce any sucrose at all. And this has been very interesting because we've been learning about the fact that manuka, for example, has very low sucrose levels. It provides mostly fructose and glucose. And then some plants are providing a combination of all three. So the nectar is attracting the insects. Why? Because the plant wants to be pollinated, and so it can produce seeds. So the plant's got to offer these rewards, and that's the nectar, but there's also other things the plant offers, and this is the pollen, the protein-rich pollen, and actually we're finding more and more that actually the nectars are containing protein as well. So this is quite important for bees. But it's also this range and extensive list, which I've only probably touched on a few of them, that just really are important. And these are the things we find in honey and why it's so healthful and beneficial to humans as well. So let's look at protein now. This is what the bee needs. Pollen, as the bees are collecting it, it's broken down using the bee enzymes. And the pollen is the item that contains the protein, the nutrient, the nitrogen-rich compounds. And this protein can be broken into individual amino acids, and these amino acids can then link up and make these peptides and more complex amino acids. And that's what an amino acid looks like down the bottom. And we have honey, as you know, in a pot, but we can actually extract the protein out of honey. And so we can start to look at what are some of these things in the proteins that they've got. And it's very interesting to find that a lot of different pollens cannot provide all the essential amino acids. Some of them are only providing a couple, so that's where we're getting to diversity. If you want to get all the essential amino acids, and here they are, and the non-essential amino acids, then you have to be looking at a multiple array of different pollens because no one pollen can do it all. And essential amino acids are essential for humans as well as bees because they can't be synthesized by the body by just breaking up those proteins and joining them together. You can only get them through food. So if it's not available, then you can't digest the protein properly. So as John's already outlined, you need the protein right at the early stage of bees' life to get the optimal growth for the young bees and develop those hyperphalangeal glands in the nurse worker bees. Once the nursing duties are finished, that's it. Protein doesn't matter really anymore, and they're on to collecting nectar from the field. And basically the adult bees are surviving on carbohydrates alone, and that's providing the carbon for the wax production and all the muscular and body activities that they need to fan the honey and to do all the things that they're doing in the hives. So really, pollen is a superfood. It contains the richest source of all these vitamins and minerals and amino acids that we know of. In fact, a teaspoon of pollen is very beneficial to humans as well. And fortunately for the bees, most pollens contain all the right proportion of these components, which is another value. You don't have to add anything in. Pollen does it all. So why do bees need pollen? Well, when they have a good diet, they're far more resistant to all these different stresses that Barry's just talked about. If you've got a good pollen diet, they're going to live longer. And bees exposed to disease, it's been proven that they have a much longer lifespan if they're eating pollen than infected bees without the pollen diet. So really, you know, if you've got bee diseases in your hives, one of the strongest things you can be doing is knowing that you've got a good pollen source around for them to collect. So there's been a little bit of, considerable amount of work done overseas on pollen. And one of the biggest people who've done this work is Doug Somerville in Australia. Fat Bees, Skinny Bees, downloaded off the web. It's a marvellous book to read. And his research could be summarised in the fact that bees need protein, and anything over 20% or more protein is a good pollen content. And I'm not going to talk more about that. I'm going to leave that for Linda to talk about. But what he does say is that lower pollen protein contents are fine because often what we're seeing in those pollens are high lipids, and they're really important for bees as well. They're the fats, the stored fats that bees can take on board. So just because Linda's going to say, look, this pollen doesn't have 20% or more, doesn't mean you shouldn't discount it. In fact, you can have very good pollens at 10, 15% because you've got to consider some of these other essential amino acids, lipids, or other factors that they're also delivering. So this is a very critical thing, and this takes far more from what Linda's working with into another level as well of bee health and bee nutrition. And that's why we're going going to talk quickly about lipids. Pollens with high lipid contents are very attractive to bees, and it's all about observing the bees. We want to know what they prefer, and I think Linda's also working on preference here. And again, often we can find what they prefer isn't high in protein, and we're like, oh gosh, you know, that's a bit weird. But probably there's a lot more going on in the pollen than we actually still understand, and this is where the research needs to keep going. And although the protein content is lower, the bees are getting the nutritional benefits from these lipids. Plants like dandelions and brassicas, they've got very good lipid content, even though they're only around about the 12 or 15% protein, which wouldn't qualify as a high protein plant, but they're still very helpful. And they've also got these fatty acids, which are very essential for bee health in them as well. Now this graph, all I want to show you from this graph is basically they caged some bees, they fed them different pollen diets, and they just wanted to see how many bees could be reared on the different diets. And while, I'm just sort of looking here, what's just that one? Right, so basically to summarise it all, the clover worked best, it reared the most amount of bees, but they ate a tremendous amount of pollen to get there. Whereas some of the others, you can see there were about a third of the amount of bees, and they ate probably just over half the amount of pollen to get that. But what we're seeing is that bees do have a nutritional preference, and colonies which do consume more pollen can rear more bees. So if the pollen's available, you're going to get the bee numbers up there. So what sort of carbohydrate sources can bees use? Well, they're very interested in the nectars, of course, and I'll say more as we go on about why I think Trees for Bees will eventually, or should eventually, not only concentrate on pollen, but the nectar as well. But they can use the honeydews or honeys that they've stored in the box. Now we're trying to force bees to do more on less, so we have to actually give them supplementary feeding, and that feeding can include cane sugar, high fructose corn syrups, wheat, rice, cassava is used in China, and to some extent plant juices and fruit juices as well. Now, we know that nectar is the best superfood for a carbohydrate source, but if you need to maintain your bees, what's probably going to be the best? And this is something I found, back from 1978 published. And what this graph does is it's used 4 different carbohydrate sources. It's looked at the lifespan of the bees on these 4 different carbohydrate sources. The grape syrup unfortunately made the bees get dysentery. They didn't like that at all, and most of them died. So don't try that one. And again, you've got the high fructose corn syrup, which can actually start to put HMF, which is hydromethylfurfuran, into your honey, and that again is toxic at certain levels to bees as well. So we're starting to look here at the sucrose in the honey, and you can see even on the maintenance diets, the sucrose was outstanding. You start to look at this consumption of the material per bee day, and you can see that they really like all these main sources. They didn't like the grapes much, but the honey, obviously you're getting more honey production when you're feeding honey back because the honey production's up, but really on wax and the honey versus syrup and such like, it's all very similar until you get to the cap cells, and you can see here that the sucrose actually, with the extra rich carbons that it's got, concentrated carbons in the sucrose, is really good for helping to get those cells capped and the brood going through. So it's really feeding the bees and really boosting them. That's why we use cane sugar sucrose in New Zealand. People have asked me, oh, why aren't we using this high fructose corn syrup? Because you can't buy it in New Zealand. And thankfully you can't, because there are a lot of problems with the extra fructose in it for the bees, and I don't think it's ideal. But this excess sugar feeding is becoming a problem. This is something I'm working on with the honey industry, and you can see that by feeding a dyed sugar syrup solution here, it goes straight into the beehive. The bees, as we've already heard, don't consume everything. Their mission is to store, so they are storing, and these things can be shifted around at any time to make room for extra brood, and often stored sugars in the brood box can then be taken up and put into collection boxes, and sometimes you're collecting not only honey but evaporated down sugar syrup as well. So that's one of the prime things we're trying to educate beekeepers on. Yes, you need to feed sugar. Yes, you can feed sugar, but you need to be very careful about when you're doing it. If you've got nectar plants around you, more the better. So when do bees need supplementary feeding? Well, we've already heard a lot about it. They need it for nectar flows, for pollination building up. times of pollen and nectar dearth. You see, I'm talking about nectar as well because it's not all about pollen. I'm sorry, I know we're here to talk about nectar, but a lot of these trees that are very good at pollen do have nectar, and I think we've got to consider that as well because this is something the bees need. If it can save you money, you don't buy sugars. And we've got all these things for boosting hives after pesticides losses or overwintering or when you're trying to get queens and such like. And of course, summer. We've had a brilliant one this year, but the last 2 years prior to that have been quite disastrous where it's got suddenly cold, it's rained, and if you don't get out there and feed right when the nectar flows should be happening, then your bees are going to die anyway. So there's times when you just have to break the rules and you have to work around that, and that's all part of hive management. So just for the protein sources, what is available for bees? Pollen, yes. But then, unfortunately, we've got this long list of other stuff which bees keepers can feed because it's got high nitrogen levels in it. It's got higher protein contents. And people seem to make up a witchery brew of a lot of these things to try and feed to their bees. And I will agree that there's some very good products out there and there's some less good products out there. And that's what we're going to talk about here is that these are 4 commercially available bee feed products on New Zealand's market. Some of them are very high in protein and that's great. But to get the bee to eat them, they have to mix them with sugar because this isn't particularly palatable to the bees like that. So then you're actually putting sugar in. And depending on when they're giving this bee product, because again, people don't always reading the rules, they can be feeding sugar unwittingly to their bees at exactly the wrong time, even though you're trying to get the protein up. And not only do they contain sugars, but the problem is some of these things contain some very concerning proteins. I've got a child who's egg, soy, dairy, and just about everything else allergic. Now, these allergens, if you're feeding the bees, they will get into the honey. Now, what happens for people with these allergies who are eating that? We don't know those effects, and we haven't done any studies, but I'm very concerned about seeing people use more and more product that may have some of these allergens going into them. So I do believe there's one product on the market in New Zealand which doesn't have some of the very highly intolerant allergens that you could expect in human health going on in them. And that's really good. But if you are using commercial feeds, make sure you know what's in it. If you're making your own, consider who's the end product who will be eating it. So what does a pollen substitute need? Well, it needs to be, as I said, palatable to the bee, easily digested, and nutritionally balanced. You have to think about how you're getting these amino acids in that pollen would naturally deliver. We know that nutritional stress is going to contribute to lower beehives, and we've seen that in 2006 there's a report out about longevity of bees, and there is a huge difference between fresh pollen and old pollen. Old pollen is, you'd think, fine, but no, the nutritional benefits only are there for a very short time. That's why we need a continuous stream of fresh pollen in there. And Feed Bee actually has been, I'm not here to purport Feed Bee, but it's been put up as one of the better bee feeds. So just to get through quickly before we have to finish, the key issue I found in a lot of the pollens is that bees are collecting other pollen and mixing it in with other nectars. And what we do for our sugar test is we're comparing the pollen values with the honey values, and if they don't match, then we could say, well, sugar's been added to the honey. Now, this is a strange method, but it's one that's used internationally, and our big problem here in New Zealand is where the bees are actually collecting pollen from different sources. And the honey and the protein, when we extract the protein, the honey and the protein no longer match. Whereas if they're getting the pollen and the nectar from the same source, then they do match. What we're hoping is that the bees are eating the pollen within themselves rather than storing it in the honey. But when you're extracting honey from hives that have been out there for a long time, they accumulate different pollens. And this is one of the causes to why our honeys are failing. And this is something that we're teaching the overseas people, that New Zealand's honeys are very unique, our plants are very unique, and what is touted as an international test doesn't necessarily fit New Zealand honeys. And we can see here too that there are a huge range of different isotope values which can blend together with a honey, which if you're feeding, which could alter your honey. So again, if you want good honey quality, you need to think about what you're going to put into your hives. There are a lot of research gaps still in proteins and particular pollen, And we're trying to fill that, obviously, with our New Zealand Pollen Identification Guide. We want to know what are the range of protein values of New Zealand pollens. We start to know that about Australian and Europeans, but for New Zealand, Linda is a pioneer. She's visionary. She's setting this out to be a real baseline for New Zealand. And I think in years to come, we're going to thank Linda, and a lot more people will appreciate her work. But nectar, again, we know they contain different amounts of proteins. When I have to extract the protein to test from different honeys are giving me different protein levels. I think nectars have been highly underrated as a protein source for bees, and this is something I think in future years we'll see a lot more of. And there's these unique compounds derived from different pollens. We know rewa and honeydew and all these different types of honeys contain all these interesting compounds that are quite unique and diverse. And I think while Manuka's been very well studied so far, well, perhaps not so well studied, but it's received a lot more attention, I think in the future our native honeys will get a lot more press as time goes on. And of course we need to know more about the amino acids and fat compositions of our pollens, because these are going to be not only essential for us consuming honey, but also for the bees. Thanks. And I just wanted to show you too that we're finding some very interesting plants that are nitrogen fixers that I didn't know Coprosma and Hebes were. Tootin, you don't want to do that one, but there we go. And so just to finish off, thanks to Linda and all the people who've been helping out. And I've also got some funding too from various people to keep my research going. And a take-home message, bees make honey from what they eat. Make sure your bees have plenty to eat that's good for them. Thank you.